Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I'm going to be talking about ancient Egypt, one of my favorite subjects. And I thought for the beginning, I would start with some background. It was hard to choose what, but today's video is going to be on Egyptian dynasties so that we can see kind of a progression of Egypt and which pharaohs were in which dynasty. That would kind of determine which gods were the most prevalent at that time. So, and what kind of worshipping they did and stuff like that. So, and there's a lot of information about everything about Egypt. So I'm just gonna go through the basics because, it's not gonna be interesting if I go on and on for like 2 hours about every single pharaoh and time period, and kind of all just blurs together. So we're just gonna go over the basics. So there are 8 different categories when it comes to Egyptian dynasties. And I'm gonna write them on this board, and then we can talk about how long they lasted and kind of at what time period that was. So hold this so it doesn't wobble. Okay, so let's talk about these 8 periods a little bit. The first one is called the early dynastic period. This is right after what they would call like the archaic period. So the early archaic period would be kind of like the nomad, almost like hunter-gatherer, that is included in the archaic period. But then comes the early dynastic period. And this is because there's signs of organization, civilization, and like written language. That's a really big thing. So after that comes the Old Kingdom. And if you have studied Egypt, or you've seen a documentary, or you remember anything about dynasties in Egypt, you've probably heard Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. And those are real things. And they're kind of like interdispersed in here, and we can talk about those. So the Old Kingdom lasted 505 years, right here. And the early dynastic period lasted 531 years. And this started in about 3150 and ended in 2686 BCE. Now let's talk about BCE really quick. So this is talking about how BC and AD used to be kind of how we dated things. And if you remember this from high school or college, probably not if you're younger, because I think they use BCE and CE now. But it really kind of, people believed it meant before Christ, BC, and after death, AD. And that's kind of how they measured periods of time regarding like history, culture, things like that. Like calendars, dates. That's how our measure of time. So it has changed to BCE and CE, which is before the Common Era and the Common Era. So when we look at things that are before the Common Era, the numbers actually go backwards. Around 3150, that means that is 3,150 years before CE, the Common Era. So that means that you have to add that number to how many years exist after the Common Era, which means it's 2023. So you would add 2023 to 3150. So that's over 5,000 years ago. And so that's kind of how that works and how that started. It's pretty easy to figure out, but a lot of people they just don't know that. So it's interesting to kind of calculate things yourself. So then we have the Old Kingdom, which lasted 505 years, and that was between 2686 and 2181 BCE. A lot of these are separated because of like different pharaohs and things, so we'll kind of get into that a little bit more in a bit here. So then there's the first intermediate period, which lasted 126 years, and that was from 2181 to 2055 BCE. Then we have the Middle Kingdom here, and the Middle Kingdom lasted 405 years. And the second intermediate period right after that only lasted 100 years. So definitely like a difference in time period and length. Then we have the New Kingdom. We're kind of getting into where we're going to get into the Greco-Roman period. It's a little bit later. We're getting closer to that. The art is definitely always changing, but it was very traditional for a very long time, and it kind of started like changing a little bit during these later periods. So that was 481 years. The third intermediate period right here started in 1069 and ended in 664 BCE. So it lasted 322 years. And then the last one we have here is the late period. And, in the third intermediate period, I believe Cleopatra was the last pharaoh that existed in Egypt. And then the late period was kind of a transition because the Romans took over, and there are art and culture started changing, and people started kind of like intermixing and mingling, and so yeah, things really changed drastically after that. So this is really just like a basic breakup of them into 8 groups. There's actually about 30 dynasties, I believe, so there's quite a few more, but it can get really like confusing. There's just a lot of information, so I like to keep it pretty simple. So 170 pharaohs reigned during this time, and maybe around 7 of those were actually women. They kind of referred to them as kings and queens. So yeah, that's how many people during this 3,000 year period actually, had control of Egypt. And yes, this is just about 3,000 years. So from the beginning, 3150, all the way till the end, which is 332 BCE, Egypt was going pretty strong until the end there. And, that's kind of defined by like their religion, their like clothing, the way they lived was kind of very much the same during this time. They kept to their, way of life and the way they wanted to live in their civilization, which is pretty cool. Also, a dynasty is usually defined, just so you know, by like the family that reigned during that time. So like it was like kept in the family for that long, and that's why they're divided into dynasties, and that's why they kind of like change a little bit, because different families are kind of reigning during those different periods. So let's kind of go through some of the basics about each period. So we're going to talk about the Archaic period, which the landscape would have been different. So probably at that time there's evidence that it was more of like a grassland, and that people were just, would travel around searching for food, which is what like a nomad is. Like they didn't stay in one place and like produce food. They, traveled around searching for food. And so then in the early dynastic period is when people kind of settled down. So in the early dynastic period, there was a unification of Lower and Upper Egypt. And I actually have a map. This might be confusing to some because we're looking at like a map, but Lower Egypt is actually at the top near this delta here, and Upper Egypt is down here. And I mean, you can probably figure this out, but when they named these areas Lower and Upper Egypt, there was no map. So the map was whatever they wanted it to be, whatever made sense to them. And Lower Egypt just made sense to them, that it was like near the water, the ocean, and it was like green, more lush. And then Upper Egypt was more up here in like the desert. So when we talk about the early dynastic period, we're talking about King Menes, and he united Lower and Upper Egypt so that he was like the first kind of like pharaoh, which that's not what their mythology says, but I mean kind of. We'll get into that later. Technically Osiris was the first king of Egypt, and then he was murdered by his brother and sent to the underworld, and now he reigns in the underworld, is what they believe. So King Menes, Menes, united the lower and upper parts of Egypt, and created the capital of Memphis. So that was like one of the first like capitals. You know, this is going back pretty far, but I will say, you know, there's like the Olmec civilizations, which go back like really far, Central America. Yeah, there are other civilizations as well. It's actually very interesting, but I don't believe in like alien connections, so, you know, it's just because I'm an archaeologist, so it's fine if you do, but I'm not gonna go there. So in this early dynastic period, there are technically two dynasties. And, you know, it's the first and the second. And the first dynasty focused more on like art and expressive forms of art. And there was a lot more support for people who were making goods and, you know, kind of settling down and like forming a specialty, you know, making things, building things, you know, those kinds of farming, you know, raising animals. You had like a specialty. So the second dynasty in the first period, there was more of an establishment of economic and political foundations and more of like a state mentality. Let's now move on to the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom has dynasty number 3 through 8. So the Old Kingdom is one of the most well known, even if you don't know it's the one that you know the most. And that's because the third dynasty, it's the first one in this category, but it's actually the third dynasty. And this is when the first step pyramid was built. That's really important because the architecture was kind of, you know, like coming into play there, and they're starting to build larger structures and kind of get a hand on how to accomplish that. And then in the fourth dynasty, which is still in the Old Kingdom, the Great Pyramid was built. And this is Khufu, Khafra. Khufu, I believe, was why the Great Pyramid was built, and then Khafra was actually his son, and he built the smaller pyramid. And if you already know this, that's fine, but they are actually tombs. That's what pyramids were used for. It's a resting place for the sarcophagi of the pharaoh, all of his goods that he wants to take to the afterlife, and all of the enchantments and spells and talismans that they would need to get to what they would call like paradise. So, in the fifth dynasty is when they introduced pyramid texts. Pyramid texts were very important because it was just something that was really vital to what we know about Egyptian art style and burials and afterlife beliefs today. So then we have the 6th, 7th, and 8th dynasty. They're also in this. Different pharaohs ruled. 6th dynasty was Pepi II. It's cute. 7th and 8th, they were all named Neferkara. And so, you know, that's kind of like the different dynasties and the families that ruled during those times. Also, the Old Kingdom is the first time that we see mummified individuals. So it's the first time that we have the embalming process happening, and that we actually are introduced to mummification and kind of the beliefs around that. And you know, I am totally gonna go in depth about mummification because it is one of the most interesting parts of Egypt that just like fascinates me still. And it did as a child, and it still does today. It's just like amazing. You know, their whole religion is just like, if they really believed that during that time. And to believe that all those gods and goddesses were real and the way their religion is, to believe that that was real would have been like so, it would have been such a magical existence. Yeah. Back to this, right? Just kind of drifting off there. So the first intermediate period is next. So this encompasses the 9th and 10th dynasty. This was the period in Egypt's history where they moved the capital from Memphis to Heracleopolis. I think that might be right, but it's a tough one. So then in the 11th dynasty, the construction of Karnak started, and the oldest construction, like structure in Karnak was built at that time. And we will, in another lesson, go over the major temples. Karnak is one of them. And, if you've seen pictures, Karnak is the one that has these giant pillars with kind of like a floral kind of scallop top. And it also has on the entrance 2 rows of ram-headed sphinxes, just lined up. Pretty cool. So Karnak's one of my favorites. So now we're moving on to the Middle Kingdom, and this encompasses the 11th through 13th dynasties. And the Middle Kingdom was really important because there was kind of like the creation or rise of a middle class in society, and so there was a lot of trade involved, and that really kind of like boosted that middle class, so that's really interesting. So the Middle Kingdom kind of represents more organization, more protection around their area and their culture, because other civilizations were starting to kind of like pop up at this point. And if you know this about Egypt, it's in what kind of is like the Fertile Crescent area, which includes Mesopotamia, which was probably, I believe it was the earliest known civilization, but I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that's right. So in the 11th dynasty, Egypt had some like issues, and it was reunited again at this time. 12th dynasty, they were building structures around Egypt to kind of like, it was like protection, so they were just guarding Egypt, so they kind of built more like fortress like structures. And then in the 13th dynasty, this is when people started appointing officials like scribes and priests and things like that. Like people had actual jobs and they were just more like structured and rigid, I guess, in their definitions, you could say. So then we go on to the second intermediate period here. And this is the dynasties 14 through 17. So, this is a pattern that you're going to see throughout the dynasties, is that they kind of like break up, and then Egypt's united, and then they break up again. So that happened again in the 14th dynasty, and 3 different capitals existed at Avaris, Kush, and Thebes. And Thebes we know pretty well. In the 15th dynasty, Memphis was attacked to gain control of the Nile, and Thebes was the one attacking them. So Memphis was attacked, and then Memphis started fighting with Thebes. They were all kind of like fighting. And so there was a war between Thebes and Avaris, and that lasted 30 years. So now we're coming to the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom had major trading Akhenaten, if you've probably heard of him, and Queen Hatshepsut. She's a tough one, but she's very well known actually. There's a lot of depictions of her. I believe there's a famous sculpture of her head, so I'll have to double check on that. The New Kingdom encompassed the 18th through the 20th dynasty. Ahmose the First founded this dynasty, but his entire reign was just like war and battles. Part of this dynasty had a period called the Amarna period, and this is when the temple, the sun disk, was built at Karnak. So it was very important. 19th dynasty, Ramses the First was the first pharaoh of this dynasty. Then the 20th dynasty is finally when the civil unrest kind of came to an end, and Sethnakht ended the period of unrest. The death of the previous pharaoh was the thing that kind of ended the civil unrest, and the pharaoh's son who took over was Ramses the Third. Then we have the third intermediate period. This period is when Egypt was conquered at Alexandria. I'm sure you've heard of Alexander the Great, and he came and conquered Egypt during this time period, at which Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. This period has the 21st through the 25th dynasties. During this time, the main palace was in Memphis, and they think that some of the individuals there might have been Nubian. So there's all this evidence that, like, things were kind of getting a little mixed up. The late period, Assyria helped reunite Egypt again, right? Come on. And then there was a Persian period because they were invaded. Egypt was invaded. The kings had much more short reigns, and they were either like thrown out or murdered. So it was like not a great time. And then there's something called the Second Persian period at the very end of this, and that's when all the kings plundered the temples and destroyed defense systems of major cities, and Egypt fell into oblivion. And then after that was just the Roman period. It's been kind of handed off to different nations since then, but Egypt was never that again. And their art and language changed. They don't speak Roman now, but they speak Arabic, I believe. And, so things just changed from there, which is kind of a bummer. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll do another one soon, of course, on something amazing about Egypt. So I hope that you got to relax and learn a few things, and I will see you in the next one.